Hello everybody! Every day behind the wheel of a Jag is usually a good one, and today I expect is to be no exception, because what we have is actually rather special. I am driving a Jaguar XKR75. As with many great cars over the years, this never started as anything official. It was instead a bit of a side project led by Jaguar's Callum, the head of design, and Mike Cross, the head of engineering. They wanted to celebrate Jaguar's impending 75th anniversary, and the company gave them a semi-official blessing, provided they did all of the work out of hours. Work on the car began in 2008, before it broke cover in 2009 at the Goodwood Festival of Speed, where a bright green example, dubbed Kermit, made its way up the hill in rather spectacular and noisy fashion. Not long after, an official production version went on sale, but in extremely limited numbers. The 75 of this car refers not only to the anniversary it was celebrating, but also total production. There were 50 cars made for European left-hand drive customers and just 25 for the UK. A very similar XKR175 was also produced for the American market, but got only the cosmetic upgrades of this car, not the mechanical ones. At a quick glance, you might think that this was merely another stripes and plaques special that underneath was just the same as any other XKR. But you'd be wrong. A huge amount of work went into this car, which is surprising given how few they ever sold. So then, what makes the XKR75? They were available only in one specification, a colour called Stratus Grey, which I think is a little bit of a disappointment, because I rather like the lurid green of the Goodwood car. The stripe on this car was an option at the time. It's a sticker, so you can easily remove it. And this car's very kind owner, Roger, has actually done half of that, because there was also a matching graphic that goes over the rear, but he felt that made it just a little bit too boy racer, so he's kept the front ones and removed the back. I think it actually works quite well. Externally, this car has a different splitter, side sill, diffuser, and much larger spoiler over the regular car. The spoiler in particular I really do like. I feel that this generation of XK really comes alive when you give it that little flourish at the back. You'll find this is a common thread with the cars that I particularly like. They've all got this little kick at the back. So Ferrari 355, the F12, Aston Martin V8 Vantage S, so on and so forth. That is one reason I've never really quite taken to the looks of the F-Type. It simply drops away into nothingness. Up front, you will find a version of the familiar supercharged 5-litre Jaguar V8. Here it produces a little bit more power than in standard guise. So you've got around 523 horses and 483 pound-foot of torque. Those are gains of about 20 respectively. However, reviews of the time implied that perhaps those claims were a little bit modest, and Mr. Callum did nothing to deny that. What really impresses me though with the XKR75 isn't the engine work, because getting more power out of the V8 isn't difficult. Instead, it's what they've done to the suspension. You've got dramatically stiffer springs, 28% at the front, 32% at the rear. The car sits 10mm lower than the regular item, and they even machined brand new aluminium uprights front and rear. That's a lot of work for a car made in such small numbers. They even beefed up the gearbox a little bit, revised the software, and made it just that little bit more dynamic. And all of this was available for £85,000, only £10,000 more than the regular XKR. Later, we saw the introduction of the XKRS, which you may well remember in the gorgeous French racing blue, and the implication is that this was very much a dry run for that car, which featured many of the same upgrades. I think this might actually be an even better looking car than the XKRS, which in some ways I think went just a little bit too far. The interior, though it is a little bit dated in terms of infotainment and the display here, feels quality. There is leather basically everywhere, contrast stitch really does lift it, the headlining, okay, does make it feel a little bit claustrophobic in here, but it's certainly a quality place. The seats don't really look like all that much at all, but they've got lots of adjustment, hug you quite nicely too with their adjustable bolsters, and visibility is not even that bad either. You've got a pretty good view of that bonnet, which you did not have in the old XK. Rear is actually not terrible either. side, pretty decent too, thanks to a lot of glass. Yes, the rear seats are absolutely useless, but they're there if you want to convince yourself that you're going to use them. And in truth, this is probably the bit of the car that saw the least changes. As I'm sure you're all aware, the car market is currently in a very strange place and prices are up across the board. To get one of these, if you can find one for sale, you're probably going to have to part with between £40,000 and £50,000, with a delivery mileage example having sold recently for over 60, but that I would consider an outlier. What then is this car like to drive? We'll start with the boring bit, and then, very shortly I promise you, we'll get on to the fun stuff. Or, if you can't wait for the loud noises, go to this point in time. This car is entirely standard, and you may have noticed it sounds rather fruity. That's because the other change made to the XKR75 was in the exhaust, where they deleted one of the centre silencers. That's unleashed a little bit of that Jaguar roar, and it sounds evil when you give it the big one. At lower speeds and around town, you can definitely sense this car is a lot firmer and tauter than the regular item, which is rather cosseting and wonderful in its own way, but you definitely get a much sportier vibe from this. This is not harsh or crashy, but if you're not fussed about performance or cornering ability, it probably is a little bit too much. You certainly get the sensation at all times it's a more business-orientated car. The 6-speed ZF automatic gearbox is excellent around town, very smooth, gear changes are imperceptible, and let's be honest here, the engine has so much torque from so few RPM, it doesn't really matter if you're in the wrong gear anyway. In fairness, if you do want a more cosseting ride, deactivate dynamic mode, which I've actually been using up until now. You can do that by holding the checkered flag button down here for a few seconds. The car's suspension system is what Jaguar, I think, call CATS. So it's a computer-controlled setup that when you activate sport mode doesn't automatically make it harder, but instead changes the profile of how the dampers work. As we are about to get to the fun bit, and the rain is on its way, and I want to enjoy this car while I can, I'm going to put dynamic back on, throttle sharpened, steering is a little bit heavier, gear shifts may be altered, but I haven't been able to test that. And if Jaguar have done what they say, this should be a rather entertaining car. I've got the gearbox in manual mode. You have 3 really: drive, sport, and do it yourself. And for this, I'm going to do it myself. A musical interlude. It's a proper Jag, all right. There is no doubting the cross-country pace of this thing, and unlike many previous XKs I've driven, this one doesn't seem to be complaining too much despite the inclement weather. This may have something to do with the fact that Roger has recently fitted a set of Michelin Pilot Sport 4S, and I know from personal experience those make a world of difference. In dynamic mode, the car's traction control is usually loosened off a little bit, but even so, the car grips. I've only seen the warning light for traction flash once, and that was at a particularly tricky section. Even so, it didn't really seem to interrupt my fun at all. Though the gearbox is still a far cry from the 8-speed you got in the F-Type, for some reason Jaguar never fitted that to the XK, it is still enjoyable. When you're talking about cars of this era, it can be a bit of a challenge to find units that are both good as an auto and in paddle shift mode. So for example, your Ferrari F1 box, they're decent enough if you're going to shift gears yourself all the time, but as an auto, completely useless. Then Mercedes, they're great as an auto, but horrid if you want to row your own gears. The kick in the back from this thing is amazing! It's also really quite well damped. At lower speeds, particularly when I have in dynamic mode, which yes, I know is wrong, it is a little bit over firm. But when you start to play, it's just right. This has always been a typical Jaguar strength, and I'm very happy to say that the XKR75 is no different. I've also got reasonable confidence in the front end. The steering, I would say, is certainly one of the weaker elements of the package. It has nowhere near the feel, feedback, or delicious weighting of, say, a 911 or an Aston Martin V8 Vantage. What I'm actually going to do now, as we may as well, is turn the car into drive, take dynamic mode off, and just see what a difference that makes. The nice thing about this car is that if you want, you can still have the gearbox in sport mode, but not the chassis and the rest of it, so dynamic doesn't alter the gearbox. This is one of the last of the pre-facelift cars, so the interior is particularly out of date. Later ones were a little bit more modern, but still pretty old feeling by today's standards. The upside, though, of both systems is that you can improve them, because you can install what's called JagDroid. As you might imagine, that is Android Auto for your Jag. That actually makes quite a big difference to me, because it means one of these is still a very viable proposition as a daily driver. There are a lot of other cars from this period where, because all of the infotainment is so wired in and you can't do anything to it, you're a little bit stuck with your system from 2010. Take it out and half the car will just stop working. In regular mode, the car is a little bit reluctant to change down, but once it does and you get beyond about 2,000 RPM, it pulls hard. A lorry has decided to pull out in front of us, so we're stuck on a road where we definitely cannot overtake them, doing about 35 miles an hour. This is as good a time as any to talk about what the car's like when you're following a lorry on a beautiful country road at 35 miles an hour. I like the interior. It's got a gorgeous old school smell about it. Things are nicely damped. This little glove box down here feels quite nice in the hand. The leather top dash, the contrast stitching do lift it. I would prefer a different colour combo for this car, but the 75 was only ever available like this. The car has a Bowers & Wilkins stereo. A 30-second radio test, hardly comprehensive, I will confess, says it's actually pretty good. Fuel economy in the car is a bit of a mixed bag. It's currently averaging 20.5. I don't know over what distance that is, and I suspect that includes a lot of me having fun. For the kind of car these are, for the amount of power they generate, they're often pretty decent. Like I said earlier, if you are desperate for more ponies out of your car, you can easily have that, but to me, I don't think that's at all necessary. There's an edge to the noise this car now makes. It's got that hard rasp that the regular item lacks. I prefer the noise of this over some which have had the back box modified. That gives you a very different tone to taking out the centre section. This is evil. The brakes are okay, they're not spectacular. I believe they may be one of the items that was left alone from the regular XKR. I am perhaps being a little bit harsh on them. I haven't really given them too much thought during the review, but the pedal does have just a little bit more travel and a little bit more softness in it than I would generally like in a sports car. That being said though, this is a GT. I do think I prefer the feel of the steering in dynamic. I believe it is, yeah, you can feel it just adding a little bit of weight. Not a lot. The difference is subtle, to the point that you can nearly say it's a placebo effect. However, I believe it is there. I also have had the benefit, off camera, of having driven a 4.3 Aston Martin V8 Vantage only about 12 hours ago. And that's key because for the kind of money you pay for one of these, you could get yourself into one of those. I'd say the Aston is the prettier looking car. It's the smaller, more compact, more sports focused item. But this is certainly a lot quicker. That was always one of the Aston's problems. The Jag just gave you so much more bang for your buck. And where it's a disappointment, Jaguar never offered this with a manual gearbox. In truth, the auto is vastly better than the sport shift in the Vantage. So if you do want to have the car be able to do its own thing, this is probably the better option. Though rear seat space is nothing to write home about, boot space is pretty good in this car. You can store more or less anything you need for a good weekend away, and you may even be able to get your golf clubs in there. Who am I kidding? It's a Jag. Of course there's room for golf clubs. How else are you going to get people to pay you the money that they owe you? In truth, there is no real one element of the XKR75 that seems to shine, but that should be taken as a compliment. Everything about this car, I like. The looks of it, I like. The engine, actually, the engine I really like. The interior is very nice. Out of date, yes, but also high quality, and quality lasts. It's comfortable when you want it to be, fun when you want it to be, sure, lacks the dynamic refinement and polish of, say, the Aston Martin, but I'm okay with that. It's a different flavour of car. This car also seems much more planted and trustworthy than other XKs I've driven, no doubt thanks to the tyres, and that means that despite the inclement weather, I'm really enjoying this car. It even feels nicely sized for this kind of road. On its own, it looks very broad, muscular, particularly from the rear, which is one of its best angles. However, compare it to, say, a V8 Vantage, and you'll see it's actually quite a narrow and tall thing, which in practice makes it very usable. It has been a very long time since I've driven the XKR-S, and I hope to revisit one on the channel soon. I'm not sure I've actually ever made a video with one, but I have driven them. And I'm personally on the fence as to whether that or this would be the car to buy. But whatever the conclusion of that review may be, I can tell you one thing for sure. The XKR75 is definitely a Jag worth your money. All that remains now for me to say is a huge thank you to Roger for bringing his car out, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.